Chapter 14, the Presidency. Your standard questions. The first thing we need to look at is, do we have an imperial presidency, or as your author says, some people say a pitiful, helpless government? It's important to look at the difference between presidents and prime ministers. The presidency is an American invention. Presidents are often outsiders. That means people become president by winning elections, not by being part of the legislature. Prime ministers are selected from among people already in parliament, so therefore they are insiders. President Obama is the third president to be elected directly from the U.S. Senate. The only other two were Warren Harding and JFK. An incumbent congressman cannot simultaneously serve in the president's cabinet. All right, the cabinet members are chosen from outside of the government. They're usually close personal friends, aides from campaigns, representatives of important constituencies. They can be policy experts, or they can be a combination of all of the above. There's no guarantee that the president himself is going to have a majority in the legislature. The president's party does not generally have a congressional majority. Usually Congress is controlled by the opposition, and that would be what we call a divided government, where one or both houses is of the opposing party. Cooperation may result in partisan bickering, and that's exactly what the founders wanted. The authors of the Constitution expected that there would be conflict, and they were definitely willing to try and take care of that with the separation of powers and checks and balances. There are some good examples in your book on page 361, the JFK example. Only FDR and LBJ had brief success leading Congress, and typically that was during wartime. Anytime that we see the presidents and the prime ministers at war, there's a definite illustration where your author on page 361 illustrates where Bush loses popularity, George W. Bush loses popularity as he gets into his second term. If you were Prime Minister Blair, you were given a vote of no confidence, and you would step down and a new prime minister would be chosen. In talking about a divided government versus a unified government, here are the two basic definitions. From 1952 to 2008, 18 of the 28 elections were divided governments. The government where one party controls the White House and a different one controls one or both houses of Congress. In 2009, only the fourth time, have you had a unified government. A divided government, the public believes, it produces partisan bickering and political paralysis and gridlock. The problem is that generally with a divided government, more gets done than with a unified government. There are certain complaints, though, with a divided government. One, it's certainly not clear that it produces the gridlock and is any worse than what would exist with a unified government. Two, even if the gridlock does exist, it's usually bad for the country, such as right now with the sequester. So we have to consider that possibility. And remember, we talked about that in class a little bit. Does the gridlock make a difference? Well, scholars have concluded that the divided governments do just about as well as a unified government in passing important legislation, conducting important investigations, and ratifying significant treaties. Divided governments produced the 1986 Tax Reform Act under Bill Clinton. See the box in your book for 6 examples on page 362. Why do divided governments produce about as much important legislation as unified ones? Well, the whole process of unified government, as we talked in class, is a myth. All party members don't see things the same way. For example, all right, you can be a Republican, you can be a Tea Party member, but you're both Republicans, but ideologically you don't see things the same way. You can see some definitive examples in paragraph 1 on page 363 in your textbook. The Constitution ensures that the President and Congress will be rivals for power, and thus rivals in policy making, hence the separation of powers and checks and balances. There are some pretty good examples in paragraph 2 of page 363 in your book, involving Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War, Jimmy Carter not being able to control a Democratic Senate to get a strategic arms limitation treaty passed, and Bill Clinton could not get the Democratic Congress, which was the same party as him, to go along with his policy on gays in the military or his health proposals. And when his budget did pass in 1993, it was only by one vote. The only time you really do have a unified government is when the same ideological wing of the party is in effective control of both branches. And that is discussed again for you on paragraph 3, page 363. We've seen that in 1933, and we've seen that in 1965. The next question is policy gridlock bad? Well, if you believe that the only purpose of the president is to lead the country, then that's a pretty weak belief. Okay? If you want the president to be just the person who is going to lead the country, then you need to change the Constitution to a parliamentary system. Okay. Typically, we vote for members of the same party as president and those who have the same ideological belief. But generally, Americans like to have a split or a divided government. One-fourth of all congressional districts will be represented in the House by a person who does not belong to the party of the president, who actually carried that district. Do voters split their tickets deliberately? We don't really know. There's no real evidence to support that. It's very non-conclusive. So what exactly is gridlock? Well, it's a necessary consequence of a system of representative democracy. It results in delays. It intensifies deliberations. It forces compromise, and it requires coalitions to enforce policy. Result, political gridlock. What's important? The power of the president and Congress and how they can work together, even during this, political gridlock. There's your examples. Now we need to look at the evolution of the presidency. I'm going to cover this fairly briefly. It's a historical background that can be looked at in your textbook. And I think in those terms, that's really where you want to take a look at the evolution. We will pick up on it at some point in certain areas as we talk, but not in any great depth. So please take notes from the section in your book. Remember that the delegates to the original Constitutional Congress feared both anarchy and monarchy. So the founders had a few concerns. They feared the military power of the president, who could overpower the states. They feared presidential corruption by the Senate, because the Senate and the president shared treaty-making power. They feared presidential bribery to ensure re-election, and their principal concern was to balance the power of legislative and executive branches. So one of the first things they dealt with was the Electoral College. Okay. Before we do that, we need to make one other comment, and that is, remember that their most frequent concern was presidential elections and the power of the president. The real sources of expansion of presidential power, the president's role in foreign affairs, his ability to shape public opinion, his position as the head of executive branch, his claim to have certain inherent powers by virtue of his office. All of these things have really ballooned, especially in the second half of the 20th century and the 21st. Hardly something that was predictable in 1787. So keep that in mind. When you're looking at the Electoral College, remember that each state has to devise its own method of selecting electors. Electors were chosen in a particular manner based on the Constitution, but once you had the problem with the way they set up the elections in the election of 1800 and the election after that, they decided to make a change. So the 12th Amendment changes the original method of the Electoral College. So no longer do you have the president winning and then the runner-up being the vice president. Or if there's a tie, which would happen frequently under the old method, all right, you don't have that with the new one under the 12th Amendment. Okay, so also, because of the way the 12th Amendment is set up, the president and vice president run on the same ticket now, and you don't have a chance of the president being a Republican and then the runner-up being the vice president, which certainly would be the Democrat. So you don't have a split presidency, vice presidency anymore. Okay, electors are chosen in whichever manner the state, all right, decides. The plan seems to meet every test. Large states have a say. Small states are protected by having a minimum of 3 electoral votes. In reality, they actually have more power than is expected. The belief was that most presidential elections would probably end up in the House. The framers did not foresee the role of political parties in national elections. So that's why they kept in the regular Constitution and then in the 12th Amendment, if there's a tie, you put it in the House. They didn't foresee that there would be very few times, if any, that it would be in the House, especially after the passage of the 12th Amendment. If you look at the inset on page 368 and 369, you will see in detail the description of how the Electoral College works. Electors meet in their state capital to vote for president and vice president after the popular vote is over. If no candidate wins a majority, the House decides the election. Electoral College ultimately worked differently than expected because the founders didn't anticipate the political parties, as I said before. 48 states use the winner-take-all method, which makes it possible to get 270 electoral votes without winning the majority of the popular vote. If you think about the winner-take-all, 10 of the largest states follow the winner-take-all. So if someone wins 10 states, they should actually win 256 electoral votes. So they're really only 14 votes short of winning the presidency. Now, as I said before, the smaller states are overrepresented. 0.3% of the popular vote is what comes from the smaller states. But they get 3 electoral votes. So that effectively what they do is they actually have more representation than their size. On page 369 in your book, paragraph 2, column 2, we can see the unforeseen effects sometimes of the Electoral College. Most Americans would actually like to abolish the Electoral College, but doing away with it entirely would have some unforeseen effects. If we relied just on the popular vote, there would have to be a runoff election among the 2 leading candidates if neither got a majority, because third-party candidates won a lot of votes. This would encourage the formation of third parties, as we see with Jesse Jackson's party, Ralph Nader's party, Ross Perot's party, etc. Each third party would then be in a position to negotiate with one of the 2 major parties between the first election and the runoff about favors it wanted in return for its support. American presidential politics might come to look like the multi-party systems in France and Italy. The Electoral College serves a larger purpose. It makes candidates worry about carrying states as well as popular votes, and it so heightens the influence of states in national politics.